Well, again, good morning, and this is the part where I talk for a little longer, so when you get restless, I have no problem. Stand up, stretch, dance in place, whatever works for you. It's not an issue for me, okay? Because I've wanted to do it a few times, so. I'm going to begin with some lines from the poet Marge Piercy. The poem is Contribution to Our Museum. The book, Living in the Open. The past leads to us if we force it to. Otherwise, it contains us in its asylum with no gates. We make history, or it makes us. This service grows from two books I published this fall. I was going to be holding them up, but they're out on the table. Both books have a common ground in an idea about history. This idea is that history is in our hands, my hands, your hands. There is no separate process of history that belongs to kings or scholars or presidents or news anchors. Every one of us is making history every instant. It's true, most of the time we're making boring history. History that seems predetermined by somebody else's script, but it doesn't have to be that way. My novel, Bloodroot Cantons, pretend I'm holding it up, is a novel. It's, I believe, and other people have told me, exciting and fun. It has a nifty plot. I touched on it a little bit. That was just the beginning. It has characters that I think people will care about. But it also does have a lesson. It's intended to show that history is not owned by the big shots, not always determined by the people who believe they're in charge. The book is a work of fiction, but it begins with a real historical event, described this way in the 1943 book, American Negro Slave Revolts by Herbert Apotheker. An indeterminate number of Virginia slaves ran off into the Blue Ridge Mountains in 1729, took along with them guns, ammunition, and agricultural implements. Their settlement, whose continued existence would have been a most disturbing factor to the entire institution of slavery, was attacked by a strong body of armed white men, and after a pitched battle, the remaining Negroes were led back into bondage. That's, of course, the language of 1943. The success of this escape, this is me again, would indeed have been a disturbing factor to the entire institution of slavery. Similar events in Jamaica, Brazil, Florida, and of course Haiti empowered people of African descent and changed the history of those places. So, in my novel, the escape turned out differently, did not end with capture. In my book of History That Could Have Been, I tell the story of Virginia and North America with the same cast of characters. I don't add any Martians, or Nazis from the future. The same people that were here, but a single real incident with a different outcome becomes a lever for change. And I hope that it will show how every person, even if designated as a slave or a savage, changes the world. The other book I published this fall is the Scalawag Scholar's Notes on Virginia. I wrote it to respond to another idea that limits our ability or our belief in ourselves that we can change history. Many of us believe there are people up there somewhere, I'm not referring to the divinity, but in high places, who are born with something indefinable that we don't have. I've learned from practical experience with hundreds of people as they grew to meet a crisis that idea is not just politically incorrect or elitist, it's not true. Those people are not the only ones who have intelligence, wisdom, ability to make change happen. My book is about the frauds and fables of the Virginia gentleman. I touched on the gentleman at the beginning. Over centuries, since the early 1600s, those frauds and fables have created a tightly woven fabric that, like all really good propaganda, consists of ideas you think you thought of yourself. They just seem like common sense because they've been around and they've percolated through so many minds. And those ideas have made Virginia especially subservient to a small elite. I speak as someone who's been organizing here for almost 50 years. Those ideas explain how the Virginia way stifles dissent so politely, though with an iron fist inside the velvet glove. I've been involved in political work, as I said, for almost 50 years here in Virginia, and over again I've seen the reticence of Virginians when called on to challenge injustice. In the 1600s, the tobacco barons enlisted poor whites on their side with the bribe of whiteness. Then in the 1800s, they sold them the absurd fantasy of an imaginary white Southern nation. The 1902 Virginia Constitution cemented in place a powerful yet almost invisible Jim Crow political machine. Our former neighbor, Mr. Byrd, Sr., pretended to be a nice paternalistic apple grower while keeping this Jim Crow system in place into the 1960s. And today his heirs give up only as little as they must. There were also great victories for freedom here in Virginia. The greatest was ending slavery. And despite Mr. Lincoln's current movie, the real abolitionist force was the millions of people who woke up every morning for centuries with their minds on freedom. The enslaved people of African descent plotted and achieved victory over both the power of the slave masters and the disregard of the white North. Much of that work happened in Virginia, as I document in my book. We're often distracted to see behind the ugly history the beauty of Virginia, and I don't want to disregard that. Even little woods behind the church, and if you haven't walked them, you should, maybe not today, but sometime, are home to deer and wild mint and cedar, hawk and blackberry and much more. But those things have survived despite Virginia's rulers. They didn't create them. What the things I can only touch on in this, what really is a brief talk, though I know it seems interminable, are these things are discussed in depth in my book, The Scalawag Scholar's Notes, and well documented, by the way, in a bibliography citing about 300 sources. As I've told dozens of younger activists and organizers, it's critical to get your facts right, especially if you don't own the press. But getting your facts right is necessary, but it's not sufficient to make change. Knowledge alone isn't power, despite what you hear. Nor does caring ensure that you will succeed. Many people who know me think of me as being passionate, especially passionate about issues. Some use a word that I personally consider condescending. They call me idealistic. The suggestion of that word to me is that I care so much I'm actually not a practical person. In fact, my commitment to the process of changing history is intensely practical. I've changed many, many lives in substantial ways by this practical work of organizing and activism. Activists and organizers are defined not by passion, not by knowledge, but by being practitioners of a craft. Like any craft, it deals artfully with real materials, human materials, which are as real as the grain of wood or the timbre of an instrument. It always begins with people who have some sense that they can make better history and some reason to want to. That's the material. You don't start with people who are completely apathetic, but people who are open to change. My craft is also known as the work of bringing about social justice. Social justice isn't charity, it isn't social service, it isn't electing candidates. Those are all necessary things. But those things take place within the realm of existing institutions. For example, our charity system, public and private, is designed to turn away some poor people with real needs every day. Similarly, our systems of employment, justice, voting, and housing are designed to disadvantage darker-skinned people, women, and others. These are all things that can be pretty easily documented. We craftspersons of history have no awe or fear of social institutions. We know a change is going to come. Things always change. That's, in fact, the only permanent condition there is. Sometimes they get worse, but they always change. And we know that change is as likely to be made by an Ella Baker or a Cesar Chavez as it is by a General Abercrombie Randolph High Pockets IV. I'm sure you all remember him. You studied him in your history books at great length. We know that tomorrow's Rosa Parks or Del Martin are still anonymous today. But we also know that, like Rosa Parks, they will not be random heroes struck by the lightning of history. They will be part of a movement, an organization, a network. They will be among organized people consciously seeking change. And my books are about such people, as well as about the barriers, the difficulties that they face, about the resistance that they get. Such people are not superheroes. Everyone in this room could be consciously making history, some of you are, or you could be supporting the people who are already making history. People like my friend Beau Flynn here has been making history in Front Royal since before I was born. Some of you probably think there was no time like that. But Beau is actually older than I am, though he doesn't look it. We almost all feel there's a human moral framework, that there's a shared idea of justice that's common to human beings. And that's the template for the craft I practice. Activists and organizers help people to reshape social institutions to fit that moral framework that we share. We're not allied with any party. We trust the oppressed, not out of correctness or pity, but because theirs is the voice that's missing. In solving their own problems, their voice is excluded, but also in solving all of our problems. And in this nation, that voice is most often the voice that was excluded when, more than 3 centuries ago here in Virginia, the fraud of whiteness was invented. You may remember that civil rights leader Joseph Lowery, giving the closing prayer at President Obama's first inauguration, quoted the song "Lift Every Voice and Sing," also known as the African American National Anthem. I wept when I heard that on the radio. I didn't even listen to the president's address. I had heard what I most needed to when I heard that. I wept because I loved that song and was so proud to hear it from the national pulpit. That song has survived and flourished in and for the core group of African Americans working for change in the NAACP, in civic groups, in churches, in grassroots groups of all kinds. That's a community that so many of us experience as an obscure dark corner of our society, but that I consider the vivid and vital foreground. I have no party loyalty, no loyalty to NPR or the Washington Post or PBS. I haven't called myself a liberal since 1967, when I was working to end the Vietnam War, which was run by liberals. I don't place reason or tolerance or evolution on my home altar. But I have a deep and steadfast loyalty to what since the 60s we have called the movement, the deep and persistent efforts for change in this society. And to the core of that movement, which has kept these words alive for a century: lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring. Ring with the harmonies of liberty. And I wish you'd heard it sung today, but it didn't happen. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun, let us march on till victory is won. This sanctuary is not a place for conversions, but I hope you will stop to think, stop to consider, maybe read my books, read others that my books are rooted in, and perhaps listen more carefully, not to the same voices I've heard, but to others as challenging and as little respected as the ones I've listened to. Perhaps you'll take on more of the part of, more of a part. Oh, I'm sorry, I have a call. What may be the most difficult job in the world and the simplest one. Changing institutions to fit the moral framework that is in our hearts. I close with coming back to the lines from Marge Piercy. The past leads to us if we force it to. Otherwise, it contains us in its asylum with no gates. We make history, or it makes us. This talk is meant to be an invitation. My books are meant to be an invitation. I know from my own life there are 1,000 reasons to hold back from that invitation. Reasons planted in the vocabulary of our minds before we even became conscious. But consider setting those reasons aside. Come and have a taste of making history with full awareness. Come see amazing acts of empowered love.